Okay, this is part two, so hopefully you watched part one, and I'm just going to pick right up. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the intent of the special education law, and this chart right here is an open response on your exam. So make sure you really understand what this is. And the reason that I put this is because a lot of the times um, it's done in the wrong order. So typically we have the evaluation and we determine if they have a disability. And if they have a disability, you should write the IEP. Then once the IEP is written, we determine the placement of the student. What is the best place for them to receive an education? Unfortunately, what happens a lot of the times is we evaluate and then we're like, oh, that child has, pretty significant autism. We should probably put him in the autism unit. And then we write the IEP and the goals based on the amount of time he would be in the autism unit. And that is not at all what should happen ever. We should write the evaluation or determine they have autism, and then we write the IEP and what that child's goals are. And then we look at the general education classroom and we see, in which classes can we provide services, or what moments would we need to maybe pull him out of the classroom into the autism room to work with him on his goals. So we should always evaluate, write the IEP, and then determine placement based on what the goals are on the IEP. So that's just something that I want to make sure I that you guys really understand, and that's why I put it as an open response, because it's something that we don't do enough. Another thing that, we talk about is this individual family service plan, and that is for children who are up to age 6. So it is a type of an IEP for students who are in preschool. So like I mentioned in part one, my son ended up qualifying for speech therapy, and so he had an IFSP. Now he doesn't need it anymore, but had he still had an IFSP, that would have turned into an IEP once he entered into the school system. So it's just a special type of an IEP that is used outside of the school system. And then this idea of transition planning is huge, and what that says is you can get special education services till you're 21, and it can be all the way up until the day before your 22nd birthday. And but we can't just say, oh, you're 22, you can't come to school anymore. We have to have some sort of plan that says you're getting ready to graduate. What are some things that you can be involved in the community, or what kind of supports are you going to need when you're not coming to school every day? Because if you think about it, somebody with a significant disability is getting their nursing care and their nutrition, a lot of that stuff they're getting at school every day. Well, if their parents are working or something like that, even though they're 22, they have pretty significant needs that are going to need to be met outside of school. So do we need to hire an at-home nurse for that child, or do we need to make sure that they know how to cook their own lunch? Things like that. So we have to plan for that thing, plan for their transition, and we start planning really early. And we talk about what skills does that child need to continue to learn to be able to function after school independently. Okay, so here we talk about placement. We are going to write the IEP and we're going to determine placement. So when we look at least restrictive environment, this is a chart that sort of goes from least to most. The very least restrictive environment is just in the general education classroom. That's it. You participate in the general ed classroom 100% of the day, no services at all. You don't need any help. That's the least restrictive environment. Now the next one, which is right here, is you're in the general education classroom, but there's either a special education teacher that can consult with your teacher, which means before or after school. You're not in the classroom with that special education teacher, but your gen ed teacher has the ability to say, like, hey, Miss Stuttenkamp, can you help me with Michael's lesson plan, because I need to adjust the test. I'm not sure how to do it. Michael's not involved with that at all. Michael never sees me. I just talk to the teacher. But co-teaching would mean that I go into the classroom and work with Michael there. So there's a difference between consulting and co-teaching. Consulting, I don't see the child, but I consult with the teacher. Co-teaching is where we share the same room and collaborate. I'm not really going to talk too much about the itinerant teacher because we don't do that often in the public school. So it's usually either collaboration or then you do resource. And resource means that you might be in the general education room for most of the day, but you go to the resource room for reading, or you go to the resource room for math. something like that. And then we've got a self-contained special class. So if you kind of draw a line right here, this side means you're in the general education classroom for at least 60% of the day. This side down here is more than 60% of the day you're outside of that general ed classroom. So starting right here, a self-contained class means that you're in the resource self-contained room more than you are with your typical peers. So it's usually called, it used to be called a unit. So it might be an autism unit, which they now call a structured teaching unit. It might be an FMD room, and they have lots of different names for these. But what it means is that the students with special education needs spend more time together in that small setting than they do in their general education classroom. And then we've got special day schools, and some children actually attend special day schools. That could be like Kentucky School for the Blind, where they go to school every day to the Kentucky School for the Blind, but they come home at the end of the day. But that would be a specialized day school. Then there's students who are homebound or hospital instruction, and so a lot of those are students who have compromised immune systems just from their illnesses that they've struggled with or something like that, and they can get instruction from either their house or from their hospital. And then the final one is residential school, and that is where people actually live and stay at the school. Currently, typically the only students you'll ever see at a residential school are those who are struggling with mental illnesses or emotional illnesses, where they have to go to, like in Lowell, there's like Our Lady of Peace, and they might stay there until doctors can figure out appropriate interventions and medications and things like that for them to be released back into their house or into the school system where they're not a danger to themselves or others. So when we talk about least restrictive, the very least, gen ed classroom only, nothing else. You're like any other typical peer. Next step, consultation. And consultation is where a special ed teacher might talk to the gen ed teacher, but they never see the student. So the student doesn't work with the teacher. Then we have collaboration and so on and so forth. So the least restrictive environment says, to what extent can we keep the child in the classroom with their peers? And that should be our goal, to keep them in the classroom with their peers as much as possible. Now, there is a group of professionals that believe that least restrictive environment is not the right terminology to use, and they think what we should say is the most enabling environment, meaning which location can we make sure that that student is enabled to the highest extent. And that is a quiz question here, and I'm pretty sure it shows up again on your exam. But when we look at inclusion, we want to look at what type of curriculum do they need, what kind of special services do they need, and where can we provide those, and who will be providing those. And so we sort of take all of that in mind when we think about least restrictive environment. So, for example, I worked with a student that needed some occupational therapy and physical therapy a couple of times a week, and so it was 10 or 15 minutes, but we had to go and practice jumping on one foot, practice skipping, practice walking on a balance beam, and I could provide that as long as the physical therapist gave me sort of like a workout menu. Then I could make sure that I'm doing that with the student. But I can't necessarily do that in the middle of her English class. So I had to pull her out of the room, which we then called a resource setting, for 10 minutes 3 times a week, because I can't bring the balance beam in the middle of a reading lesson and integrate that into the reading lesson. So you sort of look at where do the services need to be given, who can give the services, and take all of that into consideration when we're looking at which placement to choose. This is just another way to write that chart in terms of least restrictive environments. I'm not going to go over that. And then here's some videos you can watch about inclusive classrooms and why it's so important to think about including students with special needs into the gen ed classroom, because it doesn't happen as much as it could. I did not take this slide out, but I just want you to think about how you feel about inclusion, because there are people who don't believe, if I teach AP algebra, how is a student with, significant autism going to be in my classroom. There's just not a reason that they could be. And instead, we need to think about, well, maybe that's the only block during the day that they're not getting their services, and that's the only time they can be with their peers. And so what is my goal for them in this room? It's probably not going to be to learn the formulas that you're teaching in your algebra class, but maybe it is to learn to sit still or quiet, or just turn in a paper on time, or a multitude of things. So anyways, you know, when we meet in person, we discuss that, but we're not going to do that online. Okay, when we talk about collaboration, we want to make sure that we are just including both the special education teacher and the gen ed teacher and working together. So I already talked about the fact that consulting means that you have the ability to meet or talk to one another, but you don't need the student to be in place. And then we have cooperative or co-teaching, which is where the special ed teacher and gen ed teacher teach the lessons at the same time or together, and they help the students at the same time. And you always just want to look at all of these different curriculum and instructional strategies. So you could use peers, and you could have peers teaching one another. You could have class-wide peer tutoring, which is where you have different protocols where how to ask for tutoring and things like that. And you can read about all of these specific strategies in your text, or if you've already read your text, you can learn about all of them. But they're more specific ways that co-teaching works together. The other thing, and you want to make sure you take good notes on these because it's a little bit confusing, but it is also on the matching on your exam, is there's different accommodations and adaptations. So there are different things that we do for students with exceptionalities that help them achieve. So modification means we're modifying the assignment to help them do better. So maybe they're only doing the odd numbers, or maybe they have to answer the first 5, things like that. Maybe I'm doing enlarged print, things like that. Accommodations mean that they have something extra to help them. So they might get a calculator to help them, or they might get extra time. They might get somebody to read it to them or write it for them. Adaptations mean you're sort of adapting what's happening. So you might say, the class is doing my algebra formula, but you're going to do this counting sheet. So you're adapting it to where they're still doing math, but they're not doing what the other kids are doing. And then a tiered assignment, a lot of students have difficulty with just completing a whole project at the same time, so a tiered assignment just breaks it up into simpler steps to say, I still expect you to get this done, but let's do these on the way to the final assessment. When we look at teachers' roles, so some teachers are expected to do everything, some are special ed teacher responsibility, some are gen ed teacher responsibility, but all educators are responsible for making sure the child gets the accommodations that they need, making sure you're evaluating their academic abilities and disabilities. You are all responsible for referring, just like Child Find says, if you suspect a disability. Everybody should participate in conferences. Everybody should participate in writing the IEP. It should not be written just by the special ed teacher alone. All teachers should have a voice on that IEP. Both gen ed and special ed can communicate with the parents, participate in due process hearings, and collaborate with other professionals. Now, this is where it gets a little bit different. Special education teachers are responsible for those goals that are written in terms of their learning problems. So if they have a reading goal, the special ed teacher would keep the reading goal data and make sure that they're getting the special design instruction for reading that is on the IEP. They're also in charge of monitoring their behavior problems if it's a child that has an emotional behavior problem, or they have like a FBA or a behavior intervention plan, when we'll talk about that when we talk about that chapter, seeing if there's any assistive technology that might assist them, and making sure that we're following special education law. The child, and it should be just explaining what does that child need, what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and what's going to help them achieve. And then a teacher's role is to make sure they're designing a lesson that's appropriate, using newer technologies, and just keeping data. Let's see. And then we just want to be careful about how much weight we put on a standardized test for a student with disability, because sometimes that's not the most appropriate way to assess that child. Okay, And then this one just says, real quickly, that all students should be given the right, or the all students should be exposed to the curriculum. So even if you have a significant cognitive delay, you should still be presented